Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk a bit about the books I've been reading this week. As we're getting very close to Booker season, as in it's announced this, on Tuesday, this is sort of almost the last hurrah before I get to, I'm basically just sort of in full Booker mode. And also the Polari has just announced its long lists as well. So lots of reading coming. But with that in mind, here are some books I've been reading this week. And you'll see there's sort of a bit of them. A few of them are kind of ones where I'm sort of anticipating potential books on the list and or trying to clear other books out of my TBR before the book arrives, but we're also just really trying to just enjoy them all regardless. But anyway, let's get talking about books this week. First up, a bit of an oddball book, The Coin by Yasmin Zaher. And this is a bit of a wild one, and I really enjoyed where it took me on this sort of little adventure. So essentially, the idea of the story is it's a young Palestinian woman, and she is sort of just going about her life. She's a teacher. She's doing all these other things, based in the US, and sort of taking people through her world. But it's the reason I'm sort of struggling, I think, with trying to pin this down is just because she is this very odd and elusive narrator of the book. We're sort of told this through her voice, and she is often sort of jumping about between topics. She is this sort of figure who, she's a teacher in school, and she sort of gives her kids these free lessons to sort of, in some ways, do lots of creative, critical thinking about things, which is great. But then also at times she just sort of seems like she's phoning bits of it in. There are other moments where her life is just utter chaos, and she's just sort of floating through. It kind of ends, without spoiling anything, in this slightly odd way where there's a kind of essentially, which kind of keeps true to one of the central tenets of the book, which is this idea, I guess, of nature versus sort of the modern day civilized world, right? So the ways that, for example, schools have very specific things about what needs to be taught, but actually versus this kind of more organic way of kids learning, and the kind of idea of sort of a commercialized and corporatized version of work and sexuality and community and all these other things, and how all of those things feel like a disjunct from nature, or they kind of seem to be sort of somewhat distant from our real natural selves. And so the book plays around with this idea a lot, and in the meantime, there are just these sort of odd escapades where she takes these children on a school trip, and it's just all a bit odd. It's a very weird book, but in a really delightful way. She's this sort of completely idiosyncratic narrator who just sort of really marches to the beat of her own drum, and I find it fascinating. Like, she's just this very odd character. So I kind of want to sit with it a little bit longer about how I feel. I mean, I really enjoyed it overall, but just it's such an odd little book, and such an enjoyable one, I think, as well. Next, I read Determination by Tawseef, and I loved this. I think this is really brilliantly done. I think last week or the week before, I spoke about the book England is Mine by Nicholas Padamsey. And in some ways, this book engages with some of the same ideas around it's sort of at different ends of it, but kind of the effects of sort of political situations on the average person in the UK. So in England is Mine, it talks a bit about a lot about radicalism, but through the kind of lens of sort of online speech and through other things. And Determination looks more specifically at asylum, and particularly asylum cases. And so we have Jamila at the heart of this book, who has basically inherited a law practice from her father. Her father sort of still very much nosing around and sort of is, telling her how she should be doing things. But she is running this law practice, dealing with asylum claims. And we sort of see the kind of the day-to-day parts of these asylum claims. So somebody who is having to prove their sexuality, and obviously that's such a this is one of those things that comes up in the system around this, that somebody seeks asylum because of punitive laws back home around sexuality, particularly sort of homosexuality, and somebody then has to sort of prove to a court that they're actually gay, for example. And how do you do that? And the ways that you can do that feel incredibly, um, they take away your privacy. They are incredibly degrading at times. Things like people being asked to provide sex tapes and things like that, just to prove who they are. And so the book kind of looks at the kind of indignity that comes with that whole process, but also looks at Jamila, this sort of central figure who's sort of just trying to hold it all together. She's trying to keep her dad happy with this practice and knows that's impossible. She's trying to do everything she can for her client, and she again knows that that's impossible because the sort of machinations of the system, particularly it's set sort of around the time of the hostile environment, as it was called, by Theresa May, then the Home Secretary. It was a set of, for those of you outside the UK or kind of weren't necessarily aware of it, it was a sort of an intentional set of policies or kind of approaches from the Home Secretary to make it harder for people to seek asylum, and then to do things for people who were in the UK, to make it more, make a more hostile environment so that they would want to leave. And this involved things like vans going around certain areas saying, hey, look, if you turn yourself in now, your sentence will be quashed. We can get you a nice free flight home. All of these sorts of things, horrible sort of barbaric policies in many, many ways. And the book really deals with the barbarism of that. And it's interesting, Tawseef Khan as well was worked in this field, right? So understands this intimately. So what we get is just this very real and very beautiful human story of Jamila as she's trying to hold it all together. But really, the book allows us to look into the kind of the odd challenges that live within that system. That you can be someone who has lived in the UK or in any country for a long time, have really settled down, had a family, and actually some quirk of law or some kind of quirk of a piece of documentation you don't have means that everything can be taken away from you. And this book really highlights some of those things behind it, the kind of the real human costs to some of these policies. And sort of, I think it's a really well done book for that matter. I think Jamila is a really interesting and complex character in her own right. She's not just good person who's overworked. She also has, she's also this sort of odd figure who at times can't really respond to people in the way that they need because she's so overwhelmed. And there are so many things that happen within this book over quite a small amount of space, really. It's not a massively long book. And I think it's just exceptionally done. I wouldn't be surprised actually to see this appear on the book along list or on another long list at some point this year, because I think it's just an exceptional book. Next up, and some unintentional sort of theming and overlapping here, A Person is a Prayer by Ammar, Kalia, and it's published by a smaller press, Oldcastle Books, and I went to an event, I think it must have been a couple of months ago now, with Ben Reed's books. So Ben Reed's Good, rather, even. And they were kind of giving it copies. We heard the author speak about this book. And it's a really interesting book that looks at particularly the kind of, to some degree, a migrant journey as well. So this is kind of an accidental overlap. I was just trying to clear through certain books that I'd had on my TBR for a while. This book, I think, it sort of deals particularly with these sorts of journeys of sort of moving from place to place, and we sort of see through sort of three characters in a family primarily, the ways that they try to both adapt to new places but also have this real sense of where is home, where kind of it goes across three countries, the UK, Kenya, and I've now entirely forgotten the third country, and I believe India, actually. The book kind of looks at this sort of sense of identity and how you can feel sort of slightly lost in any and all of those places, but also the ways that actually kind of each fresh start can kind of allow something different for a generation. So, within a family, typically a family will have, generations who all have had a similar-ish kind of upbringing, but kind of maybe in slightly different circumstances with, you know, the passage of time or whatever. But actually, when that is also then in different countries, you have a family that almost doesn't know how to talk to each other. And I think this book really probes at some of those ideas as well. Next up, on a different front, again entirely, we've got Private Rites by Julia Armfield. I keep on going to call it Equal Rights, but that's another book I'm about to talk about. And Private Rites is I just thought it was really fun and enjoyable. I really loved Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. And in some ways, I saw her talk and she mentioned sort of some of the overlaps here. But this is also a book that involves lesbianism and water, in her words. It's sort of, I think she called it the sort of damp lesbian sort of trope in her book so far. But this is a sort of a book that almost imagines a sort of a kind of climate breakdown future in which there's sort of a rising sea level, and the ways that humans interact with each other is kind of related now very much to this thing. So although the core part of this book is very much about the human relationships between three sisters, the book kind of has this sort of slightly ominous background and backdrop of this changing world, and in some ways that does influence parts of the book, but also a large part of the book really as well could have taken place somewhere else and had a slightly different feel. And I think that's what's so interesting about it. It's not as reliant on that. This is very much about these three sisters, and particularly the ways that these three sisters interact is really sort of, you know, has that kind of family dynamic that's always so interesting, where, for example, particularly in the case of this, their father wasn't always the best, let's say, without spoiling anything. But what happens is, like, that as a result, you know, two of the sisters were kind of there for the bad bits, and the other sister was young enough to sort of either not notice those bits or to kind of grow up in a time almost after that. And so that really affects their dynamics, where the family doesn't really know how to interact with each other. You know, there's a lot of resentment from some siblings to others that, you know, you weren't even here, you don't know what it was like. But also from some sibling, you know, from the younger sibling saying, well, why are you being so harsh, or why are you doing this? And I think with a lot of Julia Armfield's sort of very characteristic sort of sly humor kind of snuck in, where there are some very funny, silly moments, but also it's just this really beautiful story of these three sisters. And as she said in this talk that I saw her at, she kind of realized after she'd sort of written it, basically, that she had to engage with the kind of the Shakespearean thing around this as well, of three sisters and a father, and, you know, this kind of trope that's come up in kind of Goneril and, you know, and Regan and I've now forgotten the other sister, and having to sort of engage with that dynamic as well, even though that wasn't the intention of the story. So there's also this kind of other meta narrative that's going on outside the book that she sort of became aware of when she was sort of going back and editing, and so there's this sort of, this book has this just a really, I think, just really cleverly observes that kind of dynamic and the ways that families do and don't get on with each other in some interesting ways. From Private Rites to Equal Rights, this is the one that I kept on mixing up the names with. Equal Rights by Terry Pratchett. And I'm sort of a late in the game kind of sort of person to, sort of player in the game to read Terry Pratchett. I didn't really sort of grow up with his books. I read Good Omens years ago. But friends of mine had always been massively into him. And a couple of years ago, I read the first two in the Discworld series. You know, without giving myself another reading challenge, I would quite like to sort of go through and read the Discworld books. And this was sort of one of those things where a couple of other audiobooks I'd been listening to had sort of, you know, I didn't have that many others in my library at the time. And I was like, sod it, let's have a little listen. Let's maybe go and have some nice fun reading with some Terry Pratchett. And just absolutely fell in love with this. Particularly, I think this is the first of the Witches books. And so we see a lot about Granny Weatherwax and her sort of young apprentice. And so this story is very much Terry Pratchett both introducing the kind of the magical world within his stories, the kind of the roles of witches and wizards and what have you. But it also sort of has an interesting take on a sort of typical kind of underdog narrative, or that kind of someone excluded from upper echelons of society. So we have our young apprentice, and she basically sort of has some kind of combination of witches and wizards' blood, or kind of powers, and she wants to go to this sort of wizarding university, and is told that she can't because she's too young and she's a witch and she's a woman, and that these things don't happen. And so this book just sort of becomes this wild tale of her both sort of trying to get there, but also trying to, you know, change her little corner of the world. And it was just so funny and stupid in that wonderful Pratchett way of just this sort of really dense packing in of jokes, where, you know, even a sort of fairly ordinary situation will have a commentary on his world building, and, you know, it's a sort of almost meta thing, or he'll talk about the world and sort of say, well, why does this thing exist, in a way that is just this absolutely brilliant sort of farcical mirror held up to earth. And so I just think there's something so enjoyable in his books, and it's just really fun to kind of remind myself of this as well, and kind of go back and read something fun like this as well. And finally, very much a book that doesn't really deal often with the happiest or funniest of topics, but is very good, I think, nonetheless. Our Fathers by Andrew O'Hagan. And so this was a Booker shortlisted book, so I'm still sort of doing my little project in the background while sort of being distracted by anything and everything. Our Fathers is sort of a tale of three generations of men, particularly Scottish men. It sort of deals with a lot of the kind of the working class and kind of stoic kind of quality that a lot of these men have, and it's kind of in them, but at the same time deals with a lot of really quite hard-hitting issues around addiction and dependency, around violence, at one point abuse, just various other things. And this book kind of comes towards this end part that really focuses in on just the kind of the complicated relationships of some of these men. You know, if someone has been horrible to you your whole life, or you've had this really strained relationship, what does it look like when you think this might be the last time you speak to each other? How do you communicate in that moment? But particularly when you're two people who have never communicated emotions, really. And so I think this book is just a really beautifully done little gem, talking about this kind of very specific type of masculinity, and I think it's really, it achieves that just so beautifully in its kind of observations. It never pities these men, really. It kind of allows an understanding that they are sort of trapped in something themselves, and I just think it's so gorgeously done, as well. So yeah, there we go, another one from my little Booker project. Only another 70 to go, or something, but yeah, no, I'm still really enjoying reading these doing this project in the background as well. Anyhow, those have been some of the books I've been reading this week. I hope you are having a really good week, and we shall see what happens with the Booker soon. I'll be doing a little live stream for the results coming in, like saying it like it's Eurovision, for the long list being announced. So I shall see you there, hopefully, and take care and speak to you all soon. Have a good week. Bye bye.